Hi there, I'm Crystal Cameron-Schaad, owner of Crystal Palette Wine and Gourmet in Norfolk, Virginia, and I'm so glad to be with you today as we rediscover the wines of Australia together. So if you've purchased the 4-pack at the shop, you should find a tasting sheet that has all of our tasting notes and some perfect pairing ideas that we can maybe snack on as we enjoy our tasting of Australia together. While you're getting everything set up, hopefully you have your wines already opened, and you'll notice, did you guys notice something about these wines? Something different that all of them have? They all have screw tops. We're going to talk about that as we get into the program a little bit more. But all screw tops, even the red wines, have all screw tops. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But let me go ahead and share my screen with you guys, and we will get started about Australian wine. So tonight we're going to have one white wine and 3 reds. But I always like to ask this question because I think people have very strong opinions on different wine regions, and Australia is no exception. So what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of Australian wine? I'm going to let you discuss that amongst your group for a second or two. So if you guys said Shiraz or Yellowtail, you're not alone. Those are often 2 of the first ones that come out when you say Australian wine. And then others may say Penfolds or Henschke. So Shiraz has become one of the most important red wines, especially of the 90s, and the Yellowtail revolution kind of led the way. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. And then we look at Penfolds, which I liken to the Mondavi of Australian wine. They make a lot of labels for everyday drinking, and then some of the most iconic, premium, and expensive wines in Australia. And then Henschke is also another very prominent producer in Australia. But it is unfortunate that so many people associate the Australian wine industry with that critter craze of a lot of bulk wine production, and it is so much more than that, and we're going to explore that tonight. So here's a snapshot of the wine regions of Australia. As you will see, most of the wines are actually, or the vineyards I should say, are located in New South Wales in the eastern part of the country. And then we do have some in Western Australia, especially in the Perth area. But when you get up into the Northern Territory in Queensland, it is simply too hot of a climate to produce wines there. Another exciting region, which we're not going to talk about or taste tonight, is the area of Tasmania down south that is producing some exceptional sparkling wine made in the Champenoise method. And here's kind of a closer look at the wine regions of New South Wales, South Australia, and Western Australia to kind of give you a closer look as to where we're going to be tasting our wines. And you'll see the little grape icons. We're going to be starting in the Eden Valley, which is pretty much in the center of your screen right here in South Australia. Then we're going to head down to Victoria for our second selection. And then we're going to go to Coonawarra, which is right here. And then we're going to finish off in Barossa Valley today. So some really great wines, 1 white, 3 reds for our selections. But let's talk a little bit about Australian wine history. So Australia has some of the most ancient soils in the world, dating back 4.4 billion years. So there is a lot of very special terroirs and climates, microclimates, terroirs within Australia. It ranks 6th in the world for wine production. The very first vines were planted here back in 1778. A lot of those clippings came over from South Africa, and those came from Europe. In 1960, they were only making roughly 1 million cases of wine in Australia. To 2010 with 134 million cases. About 100 plus grape varieties they've become known for throughout the country, 65 wine regions, and roughly 2,500 wineries throughout Australia. The wine industry brings in about $35 billion a year to the annual economy, and China actually accounts for 25% of their current exports. We can expect that number to continue to climb. In fact, there's a lot of metrics out there that are showing that China will soon become the #1 wine producing nation in the world. Australia boasts some of the oldest grapevines in the world that are phylloxera free. So if you've not heard the term phylloxera, or maybe you have, you've been around a lot of wine geeks in your life, it is a little vineyard louse that destroyed much of the world's vines a couple times over in the past couple of centuries. So when we look at how kind of isolated Australia is from the rest of the world, they do boast some of the oldest grapevines in the world. In fact, there is a producer, the Mururu Shiraz is a Shiraz from Barossa from the vines were planted back in 1847, and they're still producing very small allocation, small production wines, I should say, but some really special wines from 170-year-old vines, some really cool things. I mentioned screw caps earlier on. Screw caps actually seal 98% of Australian bottles, even the premium selections. There's a couple of reasons behind that. So screw caps, when we look at where Australia is located in the globe, Australia is very far away from Portugal and Spain, where most of the world's cork products come from. And what's interesting to note is that when you look at cork, real natural cork, the fashion industry actually usually gets the first crack at cork to be able for all of their fashionable merchandise and products like handbags and wallets and all kinds of shoes and things like that. So even before the wine industry gets the premium cork, it's usually the fashion industry. And if you've been to Portugal, you understand exactly what I'm talking about. Everything, you can buy pretty much anything made from cork. So by the time, and then after that, the Europeans usually get the second passing at the cork. And by the time it actually gets down to Australia, they had found they had a lot of issues in tainted cork. And cork flaws, or TCA, trichloroanisole, it is a flaw found within the cork, and it's usually from unhygienic bottling lines. And oftentimes when you're producing cork, when you peel the bark off a cork tree and you layer it and then you punch it out to create the cork, if there's any moisture in between those layers, that can also create that mold effect. So that TCA affects, it costs the wine industry millions upon millions of dollars a year. And Australia had found that it was actually affecting like 20+% of their bottles, where in America it's more under that 5% point. So that was a huge issue. They were literally throwing away gallons and gallons of wine every year because of this cork taint epidemic they were experiencing. So they've really turned to screw caps for their wines. And so we're going to taste some, obviously all the wines tonight under screw cap. But going back to Yellowtail, Yellowtail entered the US market back in 2001, and their main goal and objective was to sell 25,000 cases. Well, if you look at the metrics on your screen, they way surpassed that, did about 200,000 cases in their first year. And by the time they came around as a household name in the fifth year, they were selling 5 million cases in the US market alone. So this is big money here, but it's also, mass-produced wine as well. It became the largest selling imported wine in the US back in 2012. So I'm sure almost everyone's probably had a bottle of this at a cookout or a party sometime over the past couple of decades. But it also has become synonymous with Australian wine, and a lot of those small family producers really want you to know there's so much more to Australian wine than the critter craze. So viticulture and labeling rules, when it comes to Australian wine, they're mostly known for red wines. Their red wines, I should say, are Shiraz, or we know it as Syrah, especially from France, but they call it Shiraz in Australia. Same grape, same DNA, just called different names. Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, those are their top red wines. And then white wines, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, and Semillon. When it comes to labeling rules, it has to have 85% on the label. So it has to be 85% of the varietal, 85% of that vintage, and 85% from the respective region too. If it's on the label, it has to be at least 85% of all of those above. And so let's kind of dive into Eden Valley. So Eden Valley is a cool to moderate climate. It is renowned for world-class Rieslings. The classic characteristics are really high acid, mineral-driven wines with lots of citrus flavors like lime and grapefruit. And believe it or not, some of the best Rieslings in this area can age for 10 to 20 plus years, much like some of those high quality German Rieslings. As a Riesling ages out, you can get notes of toast and marmalade that kind of develop with that little bit of bottle age on there. But what do you think about when you think of Riesling? People tend to be pretty either I'm in the Riesling camp or I'm not in the Riesling camp. And if you think all Riesling is sweet, you are in for a major surprise. This is as bone dry as it gets. Super high acid, very austere, but very friendly with many different foods. The Pussy Vale Riesling, this is the 1961 block. That means these vines were planted back in 1961. Old vine wines, when we talk about old vine wines produce less fruit. So obviously the prices tend to be a little bit higher because you have less product, but the grape berries don't compete for as much of those nutrients. So when you have fewer berries on the vines, you're getting much more concentrated flavors in your glass. So on this bottle, we're looking at the 2019 vintage here. You get a little top note, a lot of minerality in here, but there's almost this faint hint of petrol. And I actually have that in the tasting notes. And you may be saying, petrol, like gasoline? Petrol? Like, what is she talking about? So petrol is a compound. It's a TDN compound, and it comes to, it's like a flavor profile within some wines. And Riesling has more of the carotenoids than any other grape that release this TDN compound. And so it's one of those esters that we find within the wine, getting super geeky and chemistry driven on you. But that's what gives us that flavor profile. And an interesting thing we were finding in the wine industry, that a lot of the older Rieslings from Germany, we would find this TDN, this little bit of petrol note. But we're really seeing it in youthful Rieslings from Clare and Eden Valley in Australia. So that is a little bit of a note. There's nothing wrong with your wine. That is all about the terroir from where it is grown. You'll also notice lots of citrus kind of notes, like lemon blossom, kind of getting into that key lime flavor profile. And let's take a sip together. Crazy high acid. I'm like almost watering, right? Now, we let that swirl on our palate. It's almost like someone just squeezed like a lemon wedge in our mouth, and it's that rushing acidity coming down. And this is what makes this so friendly with food. So this would go really well with like fried seafood, like a crispy shrimp with a lemon aioli. It's great with ceviche with like a cilantro lime vinaigrette. That minerality works really well with raw oysters. And I love that searing edge of that acidity with like fish and chips, believe it or not. That acid cuts right through that fat. Excuse me for 1 second. Went down the wrong pipe on me. But this is what we can denote as a very high acid wine. If you take another sip of it, that is not how we drink wine. This is how we assess wine. And if you feel it up here in your jawline, almost like your jaw is almost locking, that is a characteristic of a really high acid wine. Now, this may not be your palate, or you may love this. A lot of we call them acid heads in the wine industry, people that really love high acid wines. I can appreciate a high acid wine, especially when it's paired with the right food. So I really hope that you had something really delicious to pair with this tonight, because it'll make a huge difference in how you appreciate this wine. This is not your porch pounder white wine. This is something to be paired with food. But this is a very classic example of Eden Valley Riesling with a lot of purity, a lot of minerality, a lot of citrus, and very beautiful with food. So I hope you enjoyed that. And I do apologize. I kind of got in the back of my throat there, but it's a really beautiful wine, especially paired with food. So hopefully you tried it with something yummy on that tasting sheet. So moving on, we're gonna have 3 red wines now. Moving on, we are going to head to Victoria, which is a cool climate in Australia. And we are going to have a Shiraz. And so you may be looking at your tasting sheet going, why is Shiraz the first red? Usually Shiraz are super big and jammy and rich, and why is that first one up? Well, this is a cooler climate Shiraz. So if you are into Northern Rhone Valley Shiraz, like Crozes Hermitage, this is right up your alley. So this is going to be, it's gonna come across, if you were doing a blind tasting, as more of a Northern Rhone style because of the climate. So Best's Winery was established back in 1866. It is one of the oldest family wineries in the country, and some of the oldest vines on its own roots that they did not have to be grafted or replanted on American rootstock. So these are all on their own roots, which is pretty cool. Shiraz planted back in 1867. So they've been doing this for quite a while at Best's Great Western. Here's a couple other shots of the vineyard, and you'll see on the left side of your screen, this is an example of an old vine. And if you've had a chance to go to any vineyard, you'll see that when they start and they're just like little baby vines, they're really kind of tiny. And then as it ages, it gets really kind of big and kind of gnarly. And that's what you're seeing there. But that is just a beautiful picture of a vine that is going to produce incredibly concentrated fruit. And so here we go with our wine. So we have, there's a lot going on with this wine. So on the top note, get a little bit of dried florality, kind of like that dried violets. I am in the black fruit spectrum, so I'm getting some black currants and plum, which are very common with the Syrah Shiraz grape. Getting a little bit of nutmeg, heading into like a mushroomy, and then bacon fat, which is, I always, as a hallmark of Syrah or Shiraz, it tends to have that black peppercorn and almost like that bacon animal kind of characteristic to it. So good with barbecue. So if you're enjoying this during the summer, this is going to pair with pretty much anything you want to throw on your grill. It's going to be a great pairing. But this is kind of what I like to call the antithesis of a lot of what people tend to think of Shiraz when they think of Australian Shiraz. This is my style of Syrah. Love this particular style. You'll notice on the palate, there's still some nice fruit. Getting into that black cherry, but then you kind of pull off that bacon and dried herb kind of flavor profile on the palate. So really good with aged cheeses, charcuterie, beef stew, barbecue, anything bacon wrapped or just like bacon, throw it in there. It's delicious. Sausage and fennel stuffed mushrooms and a roast leg of lamb would all pair really beautifully with this particular bottle. This received 93 points from James Suckling and Wine Enthusiast magazines. You know, I don't tend to throw out a lot of ratings. And if you've been to my shop, you don't see ratings anywhere because I feel like a lot of critics have their specific palates. And if you find a critic that lines up with your own palate, that's fantastic. But I like to kind of, I taste every single wine that I carry in the shop. And it's important to me that those wines really show the quality level and are stylistically true to what they're supposed to be. And I think sometimes we get too caught up in the rating scale when it comes to wine. And so that's why we don't tend to pay too much attention to that. But it does make you take a look when you see high ratings, of course. So moving on to our number 3 selection tonight, we are heading to an area called Coonawarra. So Coonawarra, just think of Coonawarra Cab, so CC. This is this very, very tiny little place on the map here. You see the little grape there, leading you to this very tiny little sub-region within South Australia. And Coonawarra is like shaped almost like a cigar. And that is why this wine is called the Cigar Cabernet Sauvignon. This is from Yalumba, which is a really important family in Australia. But here's a look at the soils. So Coonawarra soils are Terra Rosa soils. And the Menzies Estate Vineyard lies right in the heart of Coonawarra on the famous Terra Rosa soil. So the Terra Rosa red soil is laid over limestone. So this is the perfect combination for Cabernet. Cabernet doesn't like damp or wet feet, so that limestone allows it to drain out quite well. This valuable patch of land is considered the holy grail of Cabernet purists. With its soil vivid red in color, it is perfect for growing exceptional full-bodied red wines. And here's another angle of those soils. You see all the Terra Rosa over that limestone. So just really spectacular. And a very, very small land there. But Yalumba is the oldest family owned winery, founded back in 1849 by Samuel Smith. Their tagline is that we are fiercely independent. We embrace the magnificent unknown, letting the land lead the way and growing our vines with as little interference as possible. So they are really about letting the terroir speak for itself. And if it's your first time hearing the word terroir, we're talking about the landscape in which it's grown, the soils, when you think of what grows around, grapes are porous. So they are a product of their environment. So when you're digging down to the substrata, it's pulling up all those minerals from the substrata of the earth. The porosity of the skin, they're kind of absorbing any kind of anything in the atmosphere. So in Australia, we have a lot of eucalyptus. So the oils of the eucalyptus cling to the grape. And that's why we get some eucalyptus notes in the wine. They're not adding eucalyptus to it, but because it's a product of the environment, that's where that's coming from. The same thing in Provence. When you think of Provence and those gorgeous lavender fields, you end up getting some of that lavender perfume in some of the wines from that particular region. So that's something to think about when you're talking about wine and where it gets its flavors from. Those ambient yeasts that are that the wild yeasts. We've started seeing a lot more labels that have mentioned wild or native yeasts on the label. But Yalumba means the land around. And they have helped pioneer the use of screw caps across the country. And it is a sustainable vineyard that boasts the largest solar system of any winery in Australia. And so this is the cigar. This is a big boy Cabernet. Lots of complexity going on here. A lot of black fruits, which when we think of Cabernet Sauvignon, it's typically black fruit driven. I get some dried flowers, like almost a potpourri kind of experience on this. Black cherry, macerated berries, currants. That eucalyptus is so prominent on this particular wine. There's a little salinity in the back. And then when you actually get the wine on your palate, take a sip with you. So fruit forward, but really velvety tannins with lots of flavors of like black cherry and cassis and cigar box and a little bit of pepper and some vanilla on the back finish. Really great Cabernet, especially in that $40 price point. It's, we look at Napa, which Napa produces exceptional Cabernets. It's really hard to touch Napa cab under $50 these days. So in this price point, this really over delivers. This would be wonderful with beef tenderloin and a red wine reduction, maybe anything you want to throw on the grill, especially because we're in summer right now. So maybe like a peppercorn crusted steak. And if you're a vegetarian, portobello mushrooms are really great with this as well. Pork loin, and it plays nicely off of roasted root vegetables. This wine has 14% alcohol and was aged in new and older French oak casks for 14 to 16 months. So I often get asked the question when it comes to oak aging, when we talk about new or neutral barrel, what does neutral barrel mean? It's a really good question. So if you're wondering the same thing, I thought I'd just share a little bit about that. So new is going to be brand new oak barrels. And brand new oak barrels, depending on their toast level, is going to impart all that kind of toasty notes into the wine. So we get a lot of our vanilla from oak. We get a lot of the spice compositions from oak. Sometimes that chocolate profile comes from the oak aging. But after a couple cycles, that oak becomes what we call neutral. The acid in the wine throws off tartaric acid that sits on the inside of those barrels. And that is actually how we make cream of tartar, is from that tartaric acid from the wines. So after a couple of cycles, you get this layer of tartaric acid on the barrel. And so you're not imparting a ton of flavor into the wine, and it becomes neutral. So why do winemakers use neutral barrels? Good question. So they use neutral barrels because barrels are they're also porous. So it allows the wine to soften a little bit. That little bit of oxygen, the ingress of oxygen, will help soften those tannins and help the wine develop a little bit. So they want that to happen without imparting a lot of that brand new oak flavor profile. So if you see neutral oak, or someone mentions that neutral or second or third pass barrels, that's what that means. This is also a vegan wine. We're seeing a trend toward labeling, adding additional labels on wines from organic to biodynamic to vegan. But I mentioned vegan because when you look at wine, there are a lot of fining agents when it comes to wine. So a lot of wines are filtered and fined, and for centuries they've been using different fining agents. And it's not uncommon to use egg whites or fish bladders, like sturgeon bladders, to help fine the wine. And what happens is that they'll put the egg whites in the wine, as the wine's going through the fermentation process and everything, you have particles that are floating in that. And most people want to look at a pristine wine. So they have to fine and filtrate the wine before they bottle it. So what they do is they add a fining agent, and the fining agent helps all of those little materials or those little particles coagulate, and then they filter it right out. And depending on the agent they use, sometimes they can help soften the tannins or soften the acid and things like that. there's a reason for their specific use of different wines. But bentonite is a clay-based product that's been used for quite a while. We're seeing a lot more of it in the market, which is a vegan product. There is also some schools of thought that the alcohol kills off any of those fining agents. There's no residue left of those agents. So I kind of say that loosely, that yes, this is a vegan wine, but we are seeing a trend to using fining agents that are vegan based. So with that said, that hopefully that clears up any questions about a vegan wine and what makes it vegan versus non-vegan. It's all about the fining agents. So yes, grapes are vegan, but it's all about the fining agents used within the wine as to determine whether the wine can be labeled vegan or not. Moving on, let's talk a little about cork trees. So cork trees, 50% of the world's cork comes from Alentejo in Portugal, and it's harvested every 9 years. And so I was in Portugal back in 2019, and you'll see the number 19 on this oak tree, on this cork tree, I should say. And they put the number on there, and it takes about 9 years to grow back. And it does grow back eventually. But that is one of the reasons why cork is so expensive, because it takes 9 to 10 years to grow back before they can reuse it to produce more cork. And there's finite numbers of cork trees throughout the world. And again, most of them come from Spain and Portugal. So we are going to head into the Barossa Valley, which many of you are probably very familiar with if you really enjoy a lot of Australian wine. It is one of the premium wine regions of the area. Heartland of fine wine production. It's a warm, dry climate. Old bush vines dominate here. You can see that on your screen, those bush vines. Can you imagine how hard it is to pick the grapes off of those bush vines? Outstanding red wines. This is the home of those big powerhouse reds from Shiraz. We're seeing a lot of Grenache. Mataro is really big in Australia. It's also known as Mourvedre, and we're going to have a Mataro for our last tasting tonight. So Mataro is the Australian term for Mourvedre, or Mourvedre, which we find in France, and it's also called Monastrell in Spain. So there are thousands of grape varieties in the world, and some would even say upwards of 10,000+ when you look at the duplicative names of grapes. As I mentioned, you got Mataro, Monastrell, and Mourvedre, which are the same grape, but they're called something different in all of the different areas. So it can be a little confusing for the consumer. And then the GSM blend, which you see there, Grenache, Mataro, and Shiraz, we're seeing those really planted throughout the world because they're really good. They're really drought-resistant grapes, and they're really good in warmer climates. And we're also seeing a lot of Cabernet Sauvignon come into Barossa Valley. So Thorne Clark is our next producer, and this is a 6th generation grape grower. So we're seeing this kind of play out among all over the world, where we have these families, 4, 5, 6, 7 generations that are in the agricultural business or grape growers. And then they decided to start their own label because they're like, we're making some really quality fruit here. So let's make our own label and have a little bit of a legacy of winemaking in our families. So their label was started back in 1998. The single vineyard selection that you'll see on your bottle, it's an artisan collection of very, very small batch wines produced from single vineyards throughout Barossa and Eden valleys. You see all that information on the wine label. So this is a really cool wine. This is really big, bold, super smooth. The tannins are incredibly integrated into this wine. Let me grab my glass here. Swirl it. Release all those aromatics in the wine. It's so juicy on the nose. I mean, this is just like juicy and jammy, almost like a jelly jar on the nose. But there's a little bit of spice and some complexity too that is telling me a story, which I love because I'm all about the stories. I do believe every single wine has a story and it needs to be expressed. So on the nose, getting those juicy blackberries, some kirsch, currants, and then I'm getting into kind of that Chinese 5-spice and cardamom flavors. And there's also a little bit of vanilla on here, but the finish is, the palate is just so much fruit on this palate, but it's balanced out by nice acid as well as some of those exotic spices. Cheers. So we did the series at the Cavalier Golf and Yacht Club just a couple months ago. And we talked about, the chef over there prepared Korean braised short ribs with fried rice with us. This can play off some of those exotic spices a little bit, especially those braised short ribs work really, really well with this bottle. Barbecue or pressed lamb lollipops, grilled meats, and a ribeye with blue cheese butter is pretty exceptional with this bottle too. So I hope you are enjoying this wine. Here is a picture of the family. We're going back into Shield Estate, which we're not tasting tonight, but I did mention this is a picture of the Shield family, and we don't actually have this wine on our tasting docket for this evening, but I did want to mention this because these are the vines that were planted back in 1847, the Mururu Shiraz. And I have a few bottles left in the shop. It's $125, and it's the 2015 vintage. Got incredible critically acclaimed wine. But can you imagine? I mean, the complexity and the concentration and the limited allocation of a wine that is 160-year-old vines, right? 160-year-old vines in very, very small production. So it's really really incredible that we're able to get it here in Virginia. So we do have a couple bottles if that interests you. And I just wanted to thank you for joining me tonight for our Taste of Australia. I hope you enjoyed the lineup. So, you had your really nice high acid white wine, your dry Riesling from Eden Valley, and then exploring cool climate Shiraz, nice Cabernet from Coonawarra. And so if you're ever in a retail shop or a restaurant, you see Coonawarra Cab on that menu, you are going to be in for such a treat. And it's really a great value. It packs a lot of bang for the buck. And then ending off with that single vineyard Mataro, which has become one of my new favorites. I'm gonna love a good Mataro. So anyhow, I hope you enjoyed our tasting of Australia. I hope you learned a little bit something about Australian wine. And I look forward to seeing you in our next video. Cheers.